You need to get out of that seat, now! The words sliced through the hum of the aircraft cabin before the jet engines had even begun to roar. Whitney Harrow stood in the aisle of first class, her diamond bracelet catching the overhead light as she pointed a manicured finger at the young man seated in 2A. Jordan Cole didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his headphones and returned his gaze to the laptop balanced on his tray table, his expression carved from stone. Around them, other passengers shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to notice the confrontation brewing 30,000 feet before takeoff. Whitney's voice rose again, sharper this time, laced with the kind of entitlement that comes from never hearing the word no. What she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the quiet teenager she was trying to humiliate held the key to a technology worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and that her next move would detonate her entire life in front of a global audience. If you're watching this unfold, drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's dive in. The gate agent's voice crackled through the intercom with mechanical politeness. Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to welcome our first-class passengers to begin boarding Flight 447 to London Heathrow. We'll be boarding by group shortly. Jordan Cole slung his backpack over one shoulder and joined the line forming at the jetway. He was 19 years old, lean and tall, with close-cropped hair and a face that gave away nothing. He wore a black hoodie over a plain white t-shirt, dark jeans, and spotless white sneakers, the uniform of Silicon Valley, though he'd never set foot in California. His boarding pass showed seat 2A, first class. Window. He'd earned it. Behind him, a woman in a cream-colored pantsuit and oversized sunglasses tapped her phone screen with increasing irritation. Whitney Harrow was 46, blonde, expensively maintained, and accustomed to being first at everything. She held an executive position at Sentinel Analytics, a data firm that served half the Fortune 500. Her seat assignment was 3C, aisle. She hated aisle seats. As the line shuffled forward, Whitney's eyes drifted to the young man ahead of her. She registered the hoodie first, then the backpack, then the skin tone. Her mouth tightened. When Jordan stepped onto the aircraft and turned left toward the front cabin, Whitney's irritation crystallized into something colder. She followed him down the aisle. Jordan found his seat and stowed his backpack in the overhead bin with practiced efficiency. He slid into 2A, pulled out his laptop, and set his phone on airplane mode. The window beside him framed the tarmac in soft afternoon light. He had 12 hours to prepare for the most important meeting of his life, and he intended to use every minute. Whitney stopped at row 3 and glanced back at row 2. The kid was still there, settling in, acting like he belonged. She turned to the flight attendant stationed near the galley, a composed woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled into a tight bun. Her name tag read Simone Kerr. "Excuse me," Whitney said, her voice smooth but pointed. "I think there's been a mistake." Simone looked up with a practiced smile. "How can I help you, ma'am?" Whitney gestured discreetly toward Jordan. "That young man in 2A. I don't think he's supposed to be in first class." Simone's smile didn't falter, but her eyes sharpened. "May I ask why you think that?" "Just a feeling," Whitney said. "You might want to check his boarding pass, make sure everything's in order." Simone glanced past Whitney toward Jordan, who was now absorbed in his laptop screen, headphones already in place. She turned back to Whitney with professional courtesy. "I assure you, ma'am, all passengers in this cabin have been verified. If there were an issue, the gate agent would have flagged it." Whitney's jaw tightened. "I'd still appreciate it if you'd check." Simone held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary. "Of course. I'll confirm with the cockpit once we're airborne." It wasn't the answer Whitney wanted, but it was enough to make her feel she'd done something. She moved to her own seat and buckled in, pulling out her phone to fire off a few last emails before the cabin door closed. Jordan never looked up. Boarding continued in waves. Business professionals in tailored suits, a family with 2 small children who were quickly shuffled toward the back, a silver-haired man who nodded politely at Simone before taking seat 1A. The cabin filled with the familiar sounds of rolling luggage, overhead bins snapping shut, and murmured conversations. Simone moved through the aisle with a tray of pre-departure beverages, sparkling water, orange juice, champagne. She stopped beside Jordan and offered a quiet smile. "Something to drink before we take off?" Jordan pulled one earbud out. Water's fine. Thank you. Of course. She handed him a glass, her eyes catching briefly on the screen of his laptop. Lines of code scrolled past, dense and intricate. Working on something important? Jordan's expression softened slightly. You could say that. Well, good luck with it. She moved on. Whitney watched the exchange from across the aisle, her irritation simmering. The kid was getting service. Like he was a paying customer, like he hadn't scammed his way into that seat. She waited until Simone returned to the galley, then unbuckled and stood. She crossed the aisle in 3 strides and stopped beside row 2. Excuse me, Whitney said, her voice loud enough to carry. Jordan looked up slowly. He pulled both earbuds out and met her gaze with calm, unreadable eyes. Yes? Whitney's smile was thin and sharp. I couldn't help but notice this is first class. Jordan blinked. I'm aware. Are you sure you're in the right seat? Positive. Whitney's smile faded. Because sometimes people get confused, especially if it's their first time flying up front. Jordan held her gaze. It's not my first time. The silence that followed was pointed. Other passengers were watching now, pretending to read magazines or adjust their seatbelts while their attention fixed on the confrontation. Whitney leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to something that might have passed for concern. Look, I'm just trying to save you some embarrassment. If there's been a mix-up with your ticket, it's better to sort it out now before we're in the air. Jordan's voice remained even. There's no mix-up. Then you won't mind showing me your boarding pass. Actually, I do mind. Whitney's facade cracked. Excuse me? Jordan leaned back in his seat, his expression still maddeningly calm. You're not a flight attendant. You're not airline staff. You have no authority to ask for my boarding pass, and I have no obligation to show it to you. Whitney's face flushed. I'm a platinum member of this airline. I fly 200,000 miles a year. I think I have the right to make sure— You don't, Jordan said quietly. You have a seat assignment. So do I. That's where your rights end. The cabin had gone completely silent now. Even the family with small children in the back had stopped their chatter. Whitney straightened, her voice rising. This is ridiculous. Simone! The flight attendant appeared from the galley, her expression carefully neutral. Yes, Miss Harrow. This young man is refusing to verify his seat assignment. Simone glanced at Jordan, then back at Whitney. I've already confirmed that all passengers in first class are correctly seated, ma'am. Then check again. Simone's professionalism held, but there was steel beneath it now. Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat so we can prepare for departure. Whitney opened her mouth to argue, then seemed to remember where she was. She shot Jordan a look of pure venom before turning on her heel and returning to 3C. Jordan slipped his earbuds back in and returned to his laptop. Simone lingered for a moment, her eyes on Whitney. Then she moved toward the cockpit, her expression troubled. The Boeing 787 pushed back from the gate 14 minutes later, its massive frame turning slowly on the tarmac as the tug guided it into position. Inside the cockpit, Captain Miles Carver ran through the final checks with his co-pilot, a methodical routine they'd performed thousands of times. Miles was 53, a former Air Force pilot with 26 years at the airline. He had the kind of calm that came from flying through storms, mechanical failures, and every brand of turbulence the sky could throw at him. He'd also spent enough time in the cabin to know when trouble was brewing. The intercom from the galley buzzed softly. Miles pressed the button. Go ahead, Simone. Captain, we may have a situation in first class. Miles exchanged a glance with his co-pilot. What kind of situation? Passenger in 3C is harassing the passenger in 2A. She's insisting he doesn't belong in the cabin. I've asked her twice to stand down, but she's escalating. Miles frowned. Escalating how? Verbal confrontation. Accusations. She tried to demand his boarding pass. Is 2A causing any issues? None. He's been quiet and polite the entire time. Miles sighed. Keep an eye on it. If she doesn't settle down once we're airborne, let me know. I'll come back and handle it myself. Copy that. The intercom clicked off. Miles returned his attention to the taxi checklist, but a knot of unease had settled in his gut. In his experience, passengers who started conflicts on the ground rarely calmed down in the air. The jet reached the runway threshold and paused, engines building to a low roar. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into their seats, some gazing out windows, others already absorbed in books or screens. Jordan had his headphones on, but he wasn't listening to music. He was running through his presentation in his mind, testing every argument, every data point, every answer to the questions he knew the investors would throw at him. His entire future hinged on the next 12 hours. Across the aisle, Whitney drained her second glass of champagne and flagged Simone for a third. "Ma'am, we're about to take off," Simone said gently. "I'll be happy to bring you another once we're in the air." "I'll take it now," Whitney said. Simone hesitated, then poured half a glass and handed it over. Whitney drank it in 2 gulps. The engines roared. The jet began to roll. And Whitney Harrow made her decision. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. Simone was at her side in an instant. "Ma'am, you need to sit down. Now." Whitney ignored her. She stepped into the aisle and turned toward row 2, her movements unsteady but determined. Jordan looked up just as she loomed over him. "I know what you did," Whitney hissed, her breath sharp with alcohol. Jordan pulled his headphones down around his neck. "Excuse me? You don't belong here. I don't know how you scammed your way into this seat, but I'm going to make sure everyone knows." Simone was behind her now, one hand on Whitney's shoulder. "Miss Harrow, sit down immediately, or I will have the captain return to the gate." Whitney shook her off. "You think you're smart? You think you can just waltz into first class and nobody will notice?" Jordan's voice was low and steady. "I paid for this seat, just like you did. Liar." The word rang through the cabin like a slap. Jordan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Whitney leaned closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "People like you always think you can take what doesn't belong to you. Well, not this time." Simone's hand went to the call button on the wall. "Captain, we need you in the cabin, now." The jet was still accelerating, the runway lights streaking past the windows in a blur. But inside row 2, the world had narrowed to a single, toxic confrontation. Jordan met Whitney's gaze and spoke with deliberate calm. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me. And you need to step back." Whitney's face twisted. "Or what? You'll do something? Go ahead. Give me a reason." Simone's voice cut through, sharp and commanding. "Ms. Harrow, final warning. Sit. Down." For a moment, Whitney wavered. Then she straightened, smoothed her jacket, and returned to her seat with exaggerated dignity. The jet lifted off the runway, climbing steeply into the sky. Simone stood in the aisle, her heart pounding. She caught Jordan's eye and mouthed, "I'm sorry." Jordan nodded once and returned his headphones to his ears. But he didn't go back to his laptop, because he knew this wasn't over. The Boeing 737 leveled off at 39,000 feet, the cabin lights dimming to a soft amber glow. The seatbelt sign chimed off, and passengers began to shift, pulling out books, reclining seats, settling in for the long flight across the Atlantic. Jordan had been staring at the same line of code for 10 minutes. His focus was shattered. He saved his work, closed the laptop, and leaned his head against the window, watching the clouds drift past in the fading daylight. Across the aisle, Whitney had gone quiet. She sat rigid in her seat, her hands gripping the armrests, her eyes fixed on the seatback screen in front of her. But she wasn't watching anything. She was seething. Simone moved through the cabin with a beverage cart, offering drinks and snacks with her usual professionalism. When she reached row 2, she paused beside Jordan. "How are you doing?" she asked quietly. Jordan glanced up. "I'm fine. I want to apologize for what happened. That should never have occurred. It's not your fault." Simone's expression softened. "Still, if there's anything I can do to make the rest of the flight more comfortable, please let me know." Jordan managed a faint smile. "I appreciate that." She moved on, but the warmth of the exchange lingered. Whitney saw it, and it made her angrier. An hour into the flight, Whitney pressed the call button above her seat. Simone appeared almost instantly. "Yes, ma'am? I need to speak to the captain." Simone kept her voice level. "Is there an emergency?" "I need to report a security concern." Simone's eyes flickered toward Jordan, who was now reading something on his phone, completely oblivious. She turned back to Whitney. What kind of concern? Whitney lowered her voice, but it carried nonetheless. That boy in 2A, I don't think he should be on this plane. Ma'am, we've already established— I'm not talking about his ticket, Whitney interrupted. I'm talking about his behavior. He's been acting suspicious. Simone's patience was wearing thin. In what way? He keeps typing on his computer, pages and pages of, I don't know, code or something. He could be hacking into the plane's systems. The absurdity of the statement hung in the air. Simone took a slow breath. Ma'am, passengers are allowed to use their personal devices. There's nothing suspicious about working on a laptop. You're not taking this seriously. I am taking it seriously, Simone said, her tone firm now, which is why I'm telling you, as a member of the flight crew, that there is no security threat. What I am concerned about is your continued harassment of another passenger. Whitney's eyes narrowed. I want to speak to the captain. Now. The captain is flying the aircraft. If you continue to disrupt this flight, I will have no choice but to report your behavior, and we will divert to the nearest airport. Is that what you want? Whitney's mouth opened, then closed. She sat back in her seat, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. Simone returned to the galley and picked up the intercom to the cockpit. Captain, it's Simone again. Miles Carver's voice came through, calm but alert. Go ahead. 3C is still escalating. She's now claiming the passenger in 2A is a security threat. She wants to speak to you. Miles rubbed his temple. What's your assessment? 2A has done nothing wrong. 3C is intoxicated and targeting him for reasons I can only describe as racially motivated. There was a pause. Then Miles said, Understood. I'm going to have a word with her. Keep an eye on both of them. Will do. Miles unbuckled and stepped out of the cockpit, his co-pilot taking over the controls. He walked down the aisle with the kind of presence that made passengers sit up a little straighter. When he reached row 3, he crouched beside Whitney's seat. Ms. Harrow, I'm Captain Carver. I understand you have a concern. Whitney straightened, her voice taking on a sugary tone. Captain, thank you for coming. I've been trying to tell your staff. There's a young man in 2A who's been acting very strangely. I'm worried he might be a threat. Miles glanced toward Jordan, who was now looking out the window, headphones still in place. He turned back to Whitney. Has he threatened you in any way? Well, no, but has he made any aggressive gestures, raised his voice, displayed anything that could be considered a weapon? No, but he's been typing nonstop on his computer, and I just think— Miles held up a hand. Ma'am, I've reviewed the situation with my crew. The passenger in 2A has been nothing but cooperative. What I need from you right now is to remain in your seat, refrain from further contact with him, and allow us to complete this flight without incident. Can you do that? Whitney's face hardened. I'm a platinum flyer. I've been loyal to this airline for 15 years. And you're taking his side? I'm not taking anyone's side, Miles said evenly. I'm ensuring the safety of everyone on this aircraft. And right now, the only disruption I'm seeing is coming from you. Whitney's voice rose. This is outrageous. I'm going to file a complaint the second we land. That's your right, Miles said. But if you continue this behavior, I'll have no choice but to involve law enforcement when we arrive in London. Do we understand each other? Whitney's mouth pressed into a thin line. She nodded stiffly. Miles stood and returned to the cockpit. Simone, watching from the galley, allowed herself a small breath of relief. But she didn't relax. Because she'd seen this before, and she knew how it could escalate. 2 hours into the flight, the cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm. Most passengers were asleep or absorbed in movies. The lights were dimmed to near darkness, the only illumination coming from seatback screens and the occasional reading lamp. Jordan had finally managed to lose himself in his work again. His presentation was taking shape, each slide refined, each argument sharpened. He was so focused that he didn't notice when Whitney unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. She swayed slightly as she stepped into the aisle, steadying herself on the seat in front of her. The alcohol had deepened its grip, and with it, her sense of righteousness. She moved toward row 2, her footsteps unsteady but deliberate. Jordan sensed the movement and looked up just as Whitney reached his seat. We need to talk, she said, her voice slurred but insistent. Jordan pulled his headphones off. I don't think we do. You think you're so smart, don't you? Sitting up here like you own the place. Jordan's jaw tightened. I'm going to ask you one more time to leave me alone. Or what? Whitney leaned in closer, her breath reeking of champagne and bitterness. You'll call the flight attendant? Go ahead. They're not going to do anything. Simone appeared at the edge of the galley, already moving toward them. But Whitney wasn't finished. She reached out and ripped the headphones from around Jordan's neck, tossing them onto the floor. You don't get to ignore me, she hissed. Jordan stood, his full height forcing Whitney to take a step back. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made nearby passengers turn their heads. Touch me again, and we're going to have a problem. Whitney's eyes flashed. She opened her mouth to respond. And then she screamed. Gun! He has a gun! The word detonated through the cabin like a grenade. Passengers jolted awake. A woman 2 rows back shrieked. A man lunged for his child. Simone broke into a run. And Whitney, in a final act of malice, grabbed the glass of water from her own seat and hurled it directly at Jordan. The water hit him square in the chest, soaking his hoodie and splashing onto his open laptop bag. The liquid pooled on his seat, dripping onto the floor. Jordan stood frozen, water dripping from his clothes, his expression a mask of shock and fury. Whitney stumbled backward, her face twisted in triumph. See? See? He's dangerous! Simone reached them, her voice sharp and commanding. Ms. Harrow, step back, now! But Whitney wasn't listening. She was looking around the cabin, expecting validation, expecting support. What she found instead were faces filled with disgust. Simone hit the emergency call button on the wall, her voice steady despite the chaos. Captain, we have a code red in first class. Passenger has assaulted another passenger and caused a major disturbance. Request immediate return to gate. Miles Carver's voice came through instantly. Copy that. Aborting taxi. Returning to gate. Notify authorities. The massive jet began to slow, its engines throttling back as the captain reversed course on the taxiway. Whitney's triumph drained from her face. Wait, what are you doing? Simone ignored her, turning to Jordan. Are you hurt? Jordan shook his head, still too stunned to speak. I need you to remain seated. Airport police are on their way. Whitney's voice climbed to a shriek. You're calling the police on me? He's the one... Ma'am, you assaulted a passenger, made a false threat claim, and interfered with a flight crew. You're going to be removed from this aircraft. The color drained from Whitney's face. You can't do this. I'm a platinum member. I know people... You're done, Simone said coldly. The Boeing 777 rolled slowly back toward the terminal, its cabin lights coming up to full brightness. Passengers craned their necks, trying to see what had happened. Some were already pulling out their phones, recording the aftermath. In seat 1A, a man in a charcoal suit had been watching the entire confrontation unfold. His name was Ethan Rains, and he was the founder of a tech accelerator in London. He'd seen enough of these moments to know exactly what had just happened, and he'd recorded every second of it. He glanced at Jordan, still standing in the aisle, soaked and shaking with suppressed rage. Then he looked at Whitney, who was now arguing loudly with Simone, her voice shrill and desperate. Ethan opened his messaging app and began typing. Shetsu. The jet came to a stop at the gate. The jetway extended with a mechanical hum, and moments later 2 airport police officers boarded the aircraft, their expressions all business. Simone met them at the door and spoke in low, clipped tones, gesturing toward row 3. The officers moved down the aisle, their presence commanding immediate silence. Ms. Whitney Harrow? The lead officer said. Whitney looked up, her face pale. Yes? You need to come with us. This is absurd. I'm the victim here, that boy. Ma'am, we're not going to discuss this on the aircraft. Gather your belongings and come with us, now. Whitney stood on shaking legs, her earlier bravado crumbling. She reached for her purse, her hands trembling. One of the officers stepped closer. We're going to need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back. Whitney's eyes went wide. You're arresting me? You're being detained for assault and interference with a flight crew. Turn around. The click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent cabin. Whitney began to cry, her voice breaking. This isn't fair. This isn't... But the officers were already guiding her down the aisle, her wrists cuffed behind her back, her designer purse dangling from one officer's hand. Every passenger watched in silence as she was escorted off the plane. Jordan sank back into his seat, his hands still trembling. Simone crouched beside him, her voice soft. "Are you okay?" He nodded, though his throat was too tight to speak. "We're going to get you a new seat, and I'm going to make sure your things are taken care of." Jordan finally found his voice. "I just want to get to London." "You will," Simone said gently. "I promise." 20 minutes later, the cabin door closed again. Jordan had been moved to a different seat, his soaked hoodie replaced with an airline blanket. His laptop bag sat beside him, the contents mostly dry, though he hadn't checked yet. The Boeing 777 pushed back from the gate for the second time, and as the jet climbed into the night sky, Ethan Rains uploaded a video to his social media account. The caption read, "Racism at 39,000 feet. This is what happens when privilege meets consequences." Within an hour, the video had 10,000 views. Within 3 hours, it had 1 million. And Whitney Harrow's life was about to implode in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. The Boeing 777 crossed into international airspace somewhere over the dark expanse of the Atlantic, its cabin hushed in the way only long-haul flights can be, a fragile piece built on exhaustion and the hum of pressurized air. Jordan Cole sat in his new seat, 4F, wrapped in the thin airline blanket that did nothing to ward off the chill that had settled into his bones. It wasn't the temperature, it was the adrenaline crash, the delayed shock of what had just happened, the way his hands still trembled when he tried to hold his phone steady. He'd tried to return to his presentation. He'd opened his laptop 3 times in the past hour, stared at the slides he'd spent weeks perfecting, and closed it again without typing a single word. The confrontation had carved a hole in his focus, and no amount of willpower could stitch it back together. Instead, he sat with his forehead pressed against the window, watching the moonlight paint silver edges on the clouds below, trying to convince himself that the worst was over. It wasn't. Simone appeared beside his seat with a tray bearing a fresh bottle of water, a warm towel, and a small plate of cookies that looked like they'd been pilfered from the crew's private stash. She set it down gently on his tray table and crouched so they were at eye level. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice low enough that nearby passengers couldn't hear. Jordan managed a weak smile. "I've had better flights." "I can imagine." She hesitated, then added, "I want you to know that what happened back there, that's not normal. And it's not okay. The captain has filed a full incident report, and the airline will be reaching out to you directly." Jordan nodded, though he wasn't sure what good a report would do. He'd been dealing with moments like this his entire life, smaller, quieter versions of the same poison. The only difference was that this time there were witnesses. This time, someone had actually done something about it. "Thank you," he said, "for stepping in, for believing me." Simone's expression softened. "You shouldn't have to thank me for that, but you're welcome." She stood, then paused. "If you need anything at all, just press the call button. I'll be checking on you throughout the flight." After she left, Jordan unwrapped the warm towel and pressed it against his face, letting the heat seep into his skin. The cookies sat untouched. He wasn't hungry. He wasn't anything except tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and found a string of notifications waiting, texts from his business partner Marcus, who was already in London setting up meetings, missed calls from his mother, a handful of emails from investors confirming tomorrow's presentation, and then, sitting at the top of his messages, a notification from a social media platform he rarely used. "You've been mentioned in a post by Ethan Rains." Jordan frowned and tapped the notification. The app loaded slowly over the plane's spotty Wi-Fi, buffering in fits and starts until a video finally appeared on his screen. He recognized the angle immediately, shot from seat 1A, just a few rows ahead of where he'd been sitting. The footage was shaky but clear enough. There was Whitney, leaning over him, her voice sharp and accusing. There was the moment she ripped his headphones away. And then the scream, "Gun! He has a gun!" followed by the water hitting him square in the chest, the shock playing on his face. The video ended with Whitney being led off the plane in handcuffs, her protests fading as the cabin door closed behind her. The caption beneath the video read, "Racism at 39,000 feet. This is what happens when privilege meets consequences." This young man did nothing wrong. She tried to destroy him for existing in a space she thought belonged only to people who look like her. Share this. Make sure the world sees. Jordan's stomach turned. He scrolled through the comments, thousands of them, multiplying in real time. Who is she? Someone find out who this woman is. I hope she loses everything. This is why I don't fly. You can't even sit in peace without someone trying to humiliate you. That kid stayed so calm. I would have lost it. Find her. Expose her. Make her famous. He kept scrolling, a sick fascination pulling him deeper. Some comments were supportive, offering solidarity and outrage on his behalf. Others were uglier, laced with the same venom Whitney had thrown at him, people defending her right to ask questions or insisting the video didn't show the full story. But the overall tide was unmistakable. The video was going viral. Jordan closed the app and leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted to become a symbol or a headline. All he'd wanted was to get to London, deliver his presentation, and secure the funding that would allow his company to survive another year. Now he was caught in a different kind of storm, one he had no idea how to navigate. He turned his phone face down on the tray table and closed his eyes, trying to will himself into sleep. But every time he started to drift, he saw Whitney's face, twisted with contempt, convinced of her own righteousness, utterly certain that she had the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. And beneath the anger and the exhaustion, a quieter voice whispered in the back of his mind, "What if she'd succeeded? What if the crew had believed her? What if I'd been the one removed from the plane?" He didn't have answers, only the cold certainty that the world was still full of people like Whitney Harrow, and no viral video was going to change that. Across the Atlantic, in a holding cell at JFK Airport, Whitney sat on a narrow bench with her head in her hands, mascara streaking down her cheeks in dark rivulets. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a relentless hum that made her head throb. Her designer purse sat on the floor beside her, its contents, phone, wallet, lipstick, breath mints, scattered in a careless pile after the intake officer had searched it. She'd been in the cell for 3 hours. No one had told her what would happen next. No one had offered her a phone call. No one seemed to care that she was a platinum frequent flyer, that she had meetings in London, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. The door at the end of the hallway clanged open, and a uniformed officer appeared, keys jangling from his belt. He stopped in front of her cell and unlocked the door with mechanical efficiency. "Harrow, you've got a visitor." Whitney's head snapped up. "My lawyer?" "Someone from the airline." She stood quickly, smoothing her rumpled jacket, trying to reassemble some semblance of composure. The officer led her down a narrow hallway into a small conference room with a metal table and 2 chairs. Sitting in one of them was a woman in her 50s, dressed in a crisp navy suit, her expression carved from stone. "Ms. Harrow, I'm Andrea Liu, senior legal counsel for the airline. Please, sit down." Whitney sat, her hands trembling. "Thank God you're here. This whole thing has been a nightmare." "That boy." Andrea held up a hand. "Ms. Harrow, I'm not here to discuss what happened on the aircraft. I'm here to inform you of the airline's position moving forward." Whitney blinked. "What do you mean, position?" Andrea opened a leather portfolio and slid a document across the table. "You've been permanently banned from flying with our airline, effective immediately. Additionally, the airline will be cooperating fully with law enforcement in their investigation of the incident. You're facing charges of assault, making false statements to a flight crew, and interfering with the operation of a commercial aircraft." The words hit Whitney like a physical blow. "You can't be serious." "I'm very serious. I'm a platinum member. I've been flying with you for 15 years. I spend tens of thousands of dollars a year on your airline." Andrea's expression didn't change. "None of that is relevant to this situation. Your actions endangered the safety of the flight and caused significant distress to both passengers and crew. The airline has a zero-tolerance policy for this kind of behavior." Whitney's voice climbed, desperation bleeding through. "It wasn't like that. He was acting suspicious. I was trying to protect people." "Ms. Harrow, we have multiple witness statements, including testimony from the captain and flight attendants, all of which contradict your version of events. Additionally, there is video evidence that has already been widely circulated online." Whitney's face went pale. "Video?" Andrea's gaze sharpened. You weren't aware? A passenger recorded the confrontation and posted it on social media. As of an hour ago, it had over 2 million views. The room seemed to tilt. Whitney gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Who posted it? I'm not at liberty to say, but I will tell you that the airline is already receiving thousands of complaints demanding accountability. The public relations team is working overtime to manage the fallout. Whitney's mind spun. 2 million views, her face, her voice, her actions, broadcast to the world. She thought of her colleagues at Sentinel Analytics, her clients, her carefully curated social media presence. Everything she'd built over decades, crumbling in real time. This isn't fair, she whispered. Andrea stood, gathering her portfolio. Fair or not, it's the reality you're facing. I suggest you retain legal counsel immediately. The district attorney will likely be filing charges within the next 48 hours. Wait, Whitney's voice cracked. What am I supposed to do? Andrea paused at the door. That's not my concern, Ms. Harrow. My concern is protecting the airline from the liability you've created. Good luck. The door closed behind her with a hollow thud, and Whitney was alone again. She pulled out her phone, retrieved from her purse during the intake process, and opened her social media app with shaking hands. The notifications were overwhelming, a relentless cascade of tags, mentions, shares. She found the video easily. It was pinned at the top of the trending page, accompanied by her name, her employer, even her LinkedIn profile. The comments were brutal. Whitney Harrow works for Sentinel Analytics. Let's make sure they know what kind of person they employ. Called her office. They said they're looking into it. Keep the pressure on. Imagine being this racist in 2025. She deserves everything coming to her. Whitney's hands shook so badly, she almost dropped the phone. She navigated to her own profile, where her inbox was flooded with messages, some expressing outrage, others threatening, a few gleefully predicting her downfall. Her professional email was likely the same, her voicemail probably full. She tried to call her assistant, but the line went straight to an automated message. This number is no longer in service. Panic clawed at her chest. She scrolled to her boss's number and dialed, her breath coming in short gasps. It rang once, twice. Then, Whitney. The voice was cold, clipped. Edward Granger, CEO of Sentinel Analytics. Edward, thank God. I need to explain what happened. There's nothing to explain. I've seen the video. Half the internet has seen the video. It's not what it looks like. That kid... Stop. Edward's voice cut through like a blade. I don't care what you think happened. What I care about is that Sentinel Analytics is now trending on social media for all the wrong reasons. We've had 3 clients call in the past 2 hours threatening to pull their contracts unless we take action. Whitney's voice broke. Edward, please. I've worked for you for 12 years. You know me. I thought I did. There was a long pause. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Security has already cleared out your office. Your corporate accounts have been deactivated. A severance package will be sent to your home address, contingent on your signing a non-disparagement agreement. You can't do this. I can, and I have. Goodbye, Whitney. The line went dead. Whitney stared at the phone in her hand, the screen still glowing with Edward's name. Fired, banned, charged, all in the span of a few hours. She thought of the boy on the plane, Jordan, sitting calmly in his seat, headphones on, completely unbothered by her presence. She thought of how certain she'd been that he didn't belong, that she was doing the right thing by challenging him. And now she was the one who'd lost everything. The officer appeared at the door again. Time's up. Back to the cell. Whitney stood on numb legs and followed him down the hallway, her heels clicking against the linoleum in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. By the time the Boeing 777 touched down at London Heathrow, the sun was rising over the tarmac in pale gold light. Jordan had managed maybe 2 hours of sleep, his body folded awkwardly against the window, his dreams plagued by the sound of Whitney's voice and the cold metal click of handcuffs. He gathered his belongings slowly, moving through the motions on autopilot. His hoodie was still damp in places, the fabric stiff with dried water. His laptop bag felt heavier than it should, though he hadn't checked yet to see if anything inside had been damaged. Simone found him as passengers began to disembark, her expression warm but tired. "Jordan, before you go, the captain wanted me to give you this." She handed him a handwritten note on airline stationery. Jordan unfolded it and read, "Mr. Cole, I'm sorry for what you experienced on this flight. You handled an impossible situation with more grace than most people could manage. If you need anything, a statement for legal purposes, a reference, anything, please don't hesitate to contact the airline directly and ask for me by name. Captain Miles Carver." Beneath the note was a business card with a direct phone number. Jordan looked up, his throat tight. "Thank you for everything." Simone smiled. "Take care of yourself, and good luck with whatever brought you to London." He made his way off the plane and through the long fluorescent-lit corridors of Heathrow, following the signs toward customs. His phone buzzed constantly in his pocket. More notifications, more messages, more strangers weighing in on a moment he'd never wanted to become public. He silenced it and kept walking. Customs was mercifully quick. The officer glanced at his passport, stamped it, and waved him through without questions. Jordan collected his checked luggage, a single duffel bag, and stepped out into the arrivals hall, scanning the crowd for Marcus. He spotted him immediately. Tall, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair, and the kind of confidence that made people move out of his way without realizing it. Marcus broke into a grin when he saw Jordan and crossed the hall in long strides. "There he is, the man of the hour." Jordan managed a weak smile. "Please don't." Marcus pulled him into a quick hug, then held him at arm's length, his expression shifting to concern. "You look like hell, man. What happened?" "Long flight." "That's not what I'm talking about, and you know it." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Jordan the screen, the video, again. "This has been all over my feed since last night. Are you okay?" Jordan's jaw tightened. "I'm fine. Can we just get to the hotel?" Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Yeah, let's go." They walked out into the crisp London morning, the air sharp and cold after the stale warmth of the plane. Marcus's rental car was parked in a nearby garage, and they drove in silence through the early traffic, the city waking up around them in shades of gray and gold. It wasn't until they were halfway to the hotel that Marcus spoke again. "You know people are trying to figure out who you are, right? The video doesn't show your face clearly, but it's only a matter of time before someone connects the dots." Jordan stared out the window. "I know. And you know that woman, Whitney Harrow, she's already been doxxed. People found her employer, her address, everything. She got fired." Jordan turned to look at him. "Good." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That's cold." "She tried to get me arrested, Marcus. She lied and said I had a gun. If the crew had believed her, if things had gone differently." His voice caught. "I could be in a cell right now instead of her." Marcus nodded slowly. "You're right. She deserves what she's getting, but you need to be ready for what's coming next. This story isn't going away. And once people figure out who you are, they're going to want to know everything. Your company, your background, tomorrow's meeting." Jordan closed his eyes. The meeting. The presentation he'd spent months preparing for, the investors who held the future of his company in their hands. It was supposed to be the most important day of his professional life. Now it felt like just one more thing he had to survive. "I'll deal with it," he said quietly. Marcus didn't look convinced, but he let it drop. They pulled up to the hotel, a sleek modern building in the financial district, and checked in without incident. Jordan's room was on the 12th floor, a small but comfortable space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Thames. He dropped his duffel on the bed and finally allowed himself to exhale. Marcus lingered in the doorway. "Meeting's at 2. That gives you a few hours to rest. You want me to bring you anything?" "I'm good." "Jordan," Marcus's voice was gentle. "You don't have to do this alone, you know. If you need to talk, or if you need backup in that meeting." "I said I'm good." Marcus held his gaze for a beat, then nodded. "All right, call me if you change your mind." The door closed and Jordan was alone. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out his laptop, hands trembling as he unzipped the bag. "Please," he thought, "please let it be okay." He lifted the laptop out carefully. The exterior looked fine. No cracks, no obvious damage. But when he opened it and pressed the power button, the screen remained black. Jordan's heart sank. He tried again. Nothing. He checked the charging port, the battery indicator, every possible troubleshooting step he could think of. The laptop was dead. Completely, utterly dead. And with it, his presentation. Every slide, every data point, every carefully crafted argument he'd planned to make to the investors. Jordan set the laptop down gently, as if sudden movements might somehow make it worse. Then he stood, walked to the window, and pressed his forehead against the cold glass. The Thames stretched out below him, gray and churning in the morning light. Boats drifted past, indifferent to the chaos unfolding in his head. He had 4 hours until the most important meeting of his life. No laptop, no slides. And a viral video hanging over his head like a storm cloud, ready to break the moment someone figured out who he was. For the first time since boarding the plane in New York, Jordan allowed himself to feel the full weight of it all. The exhaustion, the anger, the fear. And beneath it, a quiet, stubborn determination that refused to let Whitney Harrow take anything else from him. He pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app. If he couldn't show them slides, he'd do it the old-fashioned way. He'd draw the architecture from memory. He'd explain the system in a way that made them see not just the technology, but the vision behind it. He had 4 hours, and he wasn't going to waste a single minute. Jordan sat on the hotel bed, his phone balanced on one knee, his mind already racing through the structure of the presentation he'd have to deliver without a single visual aid. The investors weren't expecting a miracle. They were expecting proof, concrete, undeniable proof that his company, Ethos AI, could do what he claimed, that his bias detection system could identify patterns of discrimination in real time across hiring algorithms, loan approvals, facial recognition software, any system where human prejudice had been encoded into lines of code. Irony wasn't lost on him. He was building technology to expose the very thing he'd just experienced on a plane at 39,000 feet. He opened a blank note and began typing, his thumbs moving fast across the screen. He started with the core architecture, how the system analyzed data inputs, identified statistical anomalies, flagged decision points where outcomes diverged along demographic lines. He broke down the neural networks, the training data sets, the validation protocols, everything he'd spent 2 years building, reduced to bullet points on a 5-inch screen. His phone buzzed. Another notification. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again, and again, and again. Jordan frowned and opened his messages. Marcus had sent him a link with a single word. Shit. He clicked it. The article loaded slowly, the hotel Wi-Fi stuttering through the connection. It was from a major news outlet, published less than an hour ago. The headline made his stomach drop. Viral video exposes alleged racism on flight to London. Victim identified as teen tech entrepreneur. Below the headline was a screenshot from the video, blurry but clear enough to show his face. And below that, a photo pulled from his company's website. Jordan Cole, founder and CEO of Ethos AI. The article laid it all out, his age, his background, the fact that he was flying to London for a critical investor meeting, even speculation about which firms he was meeting with, though they'd gotten some of the names wrong. Jordan's hands went cold. He scrolled through the article, his pulse hammering in his ears. It was fair, mostly, presenting him as the victim, condemning Whitney's actions, highlighting the absurdity of her accusations. But it also made him visible in a way he'd never wanted. Exposed. Vulnerable. And the comments section was already filling up. This kid is 19 and running a tech company? Respect. Ethos AI is exactly the kind of system we need. I hope the investors back him. Of course she targeted him. She probably saw a young black man in first class and couldn't handle it. He should sue her into the ground. Jordan closed the app and set the phone face down on the bed. His anonymity was gone. By the time he walked into that meeting this afternoon, the investors would know exactly who he was and what had happened. They'd have questions, opinions, judgments. He couldn't control any of it. All he could control was the presentation. So he went back to work. At 1:30, Jordan stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of the only dress shirt he'd packed, a crisp white Oxford that looked sharp even after being folded in a duffel bag for 12 hours. He'd paired it with dark slacks and polished shoes, the kind of outfit that said professional without trying too hard. His reflection stared back at him, eyes shadowed with exhaustion, jaw set with determination. He looked like someone who'd been through hell and walked out the other side. Good. That was exactly the story he needed to tell. Marcus knocked on the door at 1:45. You ready? Jordan grabbed his laptop bag, empty now, except for a legal pad and a handful of pens, and followed Marcus out into the hallway. They took a cab to the investor's office, a gleaming glass tower in Canary Wharf that seemed to scrape the low-hanging clouds. The lobby was all polished marble and abstract art, the kind of space designed to make visitors feel small and awed. Jordan had been in places like this before. They didn't intimidate him. The receptionist directed them to the 15th floor. Marcus rode up in the elevator beside him, his presence steady and grounding. You've got this, Marcus said quietly. Jordan nodded. I know. The elevator doors opened onto a reception area where a young woman in a tailored suit greeted them with a professional smile. Mr. Cole, they're ready for you. Conference room B, just down the hall. Jordan thanked her and walked through the glass doors, Marcus a step behind. The conference room was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Thames and a long table surrounded by leather chairs. Seated around it were 5 people, 3 men and 2 women, all dressed in the kind of expensive business attire that screamed power and money. At the head of the table sat Edmund Cross, the lead investor, 60 years old, silver-haired, with the sharp eyes of someone who'd made his fortune by knowing exactly when to bet and when to fold. He stood as Jordan entered and extended a hand. Mr. Cole, thank you for coming. Jordan shook his hand firmly. Thank you for the opportunity. Edmund gestured to the others. This is my team, Victoria Hahn, Chief Technology Officer, David Okonkwo, Head of Portfolio Management, Priya Sharma, Legal Counsel, and Robert Gillis, Senior Analyst. Jordan nodded to each of them in turn, reading the room. Victoria looked curious, her gaze sharp and assessing. David seemed skeptical, his arms crossed over his chest. Priya was unreadable, her expression neutral. Robert looked bored, already glancing at his phone. Edmund sat back down and folded his hands on the table. Before we begin, I want to address the elephant in the room. I'm sure you're aware that a video from your flight last night has been circulating online. Jordan's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. I am. We've all seen it, Edmund continued, and I want to say, on behalf of this team, that what happened to you was unacceptable. No one should have to endure that kind of treatment. There was a murmur of agreement around the table. Jordan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the sentiment without leaning into it. That said, Edmund went on, we're here to discuss your company, not the incident, so unless you'd like to address it further, I suggest we move on. Jordan appreciated the directness. I'd prefer to focus on Ethos AI. Excellent. Edmund leaned back in his chair. The floor is yours. Jordan set his empty laptop bag on the table and pulled out the legal pad. He saw the flicker of confusion on a few faces. Where was the polished slide deck? The demo? The data visualizations? He met Edmund's gaze and spoke clearly. My laptop was damaged during the flight, so I'm going to do this the old-fashioned way. He uncapped a pen, flipped the legal pad to a blank page, and began to draw. Ethos AI is a bias detection system designed to identify and flag discriminatory patterns in algorithmic decision-making. It works across 3 core layers: data input analysis, decision point mapping, and outcome validation. He sketched a simple flowchart as he spoke, his hand moving with confident precision. The room was silent, every eye on him. The first layer analyzes the data being fed into a system: resumes for a hiring algorithm, loan applications for a credit model, images for a facial recognition program. It identifies the demographic markers present in that data and tracks how they correlate with outcomes. He drew arrows connecting boxes, building the architecture in real time. The second layer maps the decision points, the moments where the algorithm makes a choice. Hire this candidate, approve this loan, flag this face as a match. At each decision point, Ethos AI runs a parallel analysis to determine whether demographic factors are influencing the outcome in statistically significant ways. Victoria leaned forward, her interest piqued. How do you control for legitimate correlations? For example, if a loan applicant has a low credit score, that's a valid reason for denial, even if that applicant happens to belong to a marginalized group. Jordan didn't miss a beat. That's where the third layer comes in. Outcome validation. Ethos AI doesn't just flag disparities, it contextualizes them. It compares the flagged decision to a control group with similar non-demographic characteristics. If the disparity persists after controlling for those variables, it gets flagged as potential bias. If it doesn't, the system moves on. David uncrossed his arms, leaning forward now. What's your false positive rate? Less than 2% in our beta testing. We've run the system on over 50,000 anonymized hiring decisions and flagged 372 as biased. Independent audits confirmed bias in 365 of those cases. Priya's eyebrows rose. That's a 98% accuracy rate. Correct. Robert set down his phone. What's the market application? Who's buying this? Jordan turned to a fresh page on the legal pad and began listing potential clients. Any organization that uses algorithms to make decisions about people, tech companies with hiring platforms, banks with automated loan systems, law enforcement agencies using predictive policing or facial recognition, even healthcare providers using triage algorithms. The market is massive, and it's only growing. Edmund's expression was unreadable. And what's stopping a company from simply ignoring your system's findings? Jordan met his gaze without flinching. Nothing. But once they know the bias exists, they're liable. If they choose to ignore it and someone sues, Ethos AI's audit trail becomes evidence. We're not just selling software, we're selling accountability. The room went quiet again, but this time it was the kind of silence that crackled with possibility. Victoria spoke first. I want to see the code. Jordan nodded. I'll provide full access to the repository once we finalize terms. David looked at Edmund, then back at Jordan. What's your current valuation? 15 million. We're raising 5 million in this round to scale operations and expand our beta testing program. Edmund's lips curved into a faint smile. You came here to ask for $5 million, and you did it with a pen and a legal pad. Jordan allowed himself a small smile in return. The tools don't matter. The vision does. Edmund stood and the others followed suit. He extended his hand across the table. We'll need a few days to review the details and run our own due diligence. But I'll be honest with you, Mr. Cole. You've made a strong impression. Expect to hear from us by the end of the week. Jordan shook his hand, relief flooding through him in a wave so powerful it almost buckled his knees. Thank you. I look forward to it. As he and Marcus left the building and stepped out into the cool London afternoon, Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. Man, that was something else. You killed it in there. Jordan exhaled slowly, the tension finally draining from his body. Yeah, we'll see. But deep down, he knew. He'd done more than survive the meeting. He'd won it. And somewhere across the Atlantic, in a holding cell that smelled of disinfectant and despair, Whitney Harrow was learning that consequences had a way of arriving right on time. The call came 3 days later while Jordan was sitting in a cramped coffee shop near his hotel, nursing his third espresso and trying to make sense of the legal documents Marcus had forwarded him. His phone buzzed against the scarred wooden table, and Edmund Cross's name appeared on the screen. Jordan's hand froze halfway to the cup. He let it ring once more, steadying his breath, then answered. Mr. Cross? Jordan. Edmund's voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there in the conference room. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Not at all. Good. I'll get straight to it. My team and I have completed our review of Ethos AI, and we're prepared to move forward, but not at the terms you proposed. Jordan's stomach tightened. Here it comes, he thought. The counteroffer that would cut his valuation in half, demand majority control, or bury him in conditions he couldn't accept. We want to increase the investment to 8 million, Edmund continued, at a 22 million valuation. And we want to introduce you to 3 additional firms who've expressed interest in joining the round as co-investors. Jordan sat perfectly still, his mind processing the numbers. 22 million, 8 million in funding. That was enough to not just survive, it was enough to scale, to hire the team he needed, to turn Ethos AI from a promising startup into a genuine competitor. There's one more thing, Edmund said. We've been following the aftermath of the incident on your flight. The public response has been significant, and we believe there's an opportunity here, not just for your company, but for the broader conversation about algorithmic bias and systemic discrimination. We'd like to help you turn that moment into a platform. Jordan's jaw tightened. I'm not interested in becoming a spokesperson. I'm interested in building a company. And you will, Edmund said smoothly. But you can't separate the two anymore, Jordan. Whether you like it or not, you've become a symbol. People are paying attention. The question is whether you're going to use that attention or let someone else control the narrative. Jordan closed his eyes, pressing his fingertips against his temple. He'd spent the past 3 days trying to ignore the avalanche of media requests, interview offers, and messages from advocacy groups wanting him to speak at conferences, write op-eds, become the face of a movement he'd never asked to join. He'd come to London to pitch investors, not to become a cause. But Edmund was right. The story had already been written. The only question was whether Jordan would have a hand in how it ended. What exactly are you proposing? Jordan asked carefully. We want to fund more than just your technology. We want to fund a lawsuit. Jordan's eyes snapped open. Against who? Whitney Harrow, personally. Not for money, though you'll certainly be entitled to damages, but for precedent. We believe you have grounds for a civil suit based on defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and interference with your business prospects. If you win, it sets a legal standard. It sends a message that this kind of behavior has consequences that go beyond a viral video and a few days in the news cycle. Jordan's mind raced. A lawsuit meant lawyers, depositions, months of legal wrangling. It meant keeping the incident alive when all he wanted was to move past it. But it also meant accountability. Real, tangible accountability. I need to think about it, Jordan said. Of course. Take the time you need. But Jordan, Edmund's voice softened. You didn't ask for this fight. But now that you're in it, you have a chance to make it mean something. Don't waste that. The line went quiet for a moment, then Edmund added, We'll send over the term sheet by end of day. Welcome to the team. The call ended and Jordan sat staring at his phone, the weight of the decision settling over him like a lead blanket. Marcus appeared at the table with 2 pastries and slid into the seat across from him. You look like someone just told you won the lottery and your house burned down on the same day. Jordan let out a hollow laugh. Close enough. He relayed the conversation, watching Marcus's expression shift from excitement to concern and back again. Man, that's huge, Marcus said. 8 million? That's life-changing. It is. But? Jordan leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window where rain had begun to streak the glass in slow, wavering lines. But it's not just about the money anymore. They want me to sue Whitney Harrow. They want to turn this into a precedent-setting case. Marcus studied him carefully. And you don't want that. I don't know what I want. Jordan's voice was rough with exhaustion. I came here to build something, to solve a problem that's been ignored for too long. Now I'm supposed to be the face of a movement? The poster child for fighting back against racism on airplanes? That's not who I am. Maybe not, Marcus said quietly, but maybe it's who you need to be right now. Jordan met his gaze. What's that supposed to mean? It means you built a system to expose bias because you've lived it. You know what it feels like to be judged before you even open your mouth. And now you've got a chance to make sure what happened to you doesn't keep happening to other people. You think that woman would have been arrested if there hadn't been a video? You think the airline would have banned her if the story hadn't gone viral? This is what accountability looks like, Jordan. It's messy and public and uncomfortable, but it's real. Jordan said nothing, his throat too tight to form words. Marcus reached across the table and tapped the legal pad Jordan had carried into the investor meeting, now sitting beside his coffee cup. You walked into that room with nothing but a pen and your mind, and you convinced them to bet millions on you. You've already proven you can do the impossible, so do it again. The rain outside picked up, drumming against the window in a steady rhythm that sounded almost like applause. Jordan pulled the legal pad toward him, flipped to a blank page, and began writing a list of questions he'd need answered before agreeing to the lawsuit: jurisdiction, timeline, legal strategy, potential outcomes. Marcus grinned. There he is. Jordan allowed himself a faint smile. Let's see what we're really getting into. Back in New York, Whitney Harrow stood in the living room of her Upper East Side apartment, staring at the boxes stacked against the wall. She'd been released from custody 48 hours after the incident, her bail set at $50,000, a sum that would have been trivial a week ago, but now felt like a small fortune slipping through her fingers. Her lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Diane Rothman, sat on the white leather couch with a folder open on her lap. She'd been talking for the past 10 minutes, laying out the charges, the potential penalties, the strategic options. Whitney had heard maybe half of it. "Are you listening to me?" Diane's voice cut through the fog. Whitney turned from the window. "I'm listening." "Then tell me what I just said." Whitney's hands clenched at her sides. "You said the DA is offering a plea deal, assault in the 3rd degree, community service, probation, no jail time. And you think I should take it?" Diane closed the folder and set it on the coffee table. "I don't think you should take it. I think you have to take it. Whitney, you're on video assaulting a 19-year-old kid and screaming that he has a gun when he clearly doesn't. You made a false statement to a flight crew, which is a federal offense. If this goes to trial, you will lose. And if you lose at trial, you're looking at actual prison time." Whitney's voice climbed. "He was acting suspicious. I had a right to feel unsafe." Diane's expression hardened. "No jury in the world is going to believe that after watching that video. You targeted him because he was black and sitting in first class. That's what the evidence shows. That's what every witness statement confirms, and that's what the entire internet believes. So I'm just supposed to admit I'm a racist, plead guilty, and let everyone think I'm some kind of monster?" "You don't have to admit anything," Diane said evenly. "The plea deal doesn't require an allocution beyond the basic facts of the assault. But yes, you do have to accept that your actions had consequences. And those consequences are going to follow you whether you take this deal or not." Whitney sank onto the arm of the couch, her legs suddenly unsteady. "I've already lost my job, my reputation. Half my friends won't return my calls. What more do they want from me?" "They want accountability," Diane said. "And if you're smart, you'll give it to them on your terms rather than waiting for it to be forced on you." Whitney's phone buzzed on the table. She ignored it. It had been buzzing nonstop for days. Reporters, former colleagues, people she hadn't spoken to in years suddenly emerging to offer opinions on her character, or lack thereof. She'd stopped reading the messages after the first 100. Diane stood and picked up her briefcase. "I need an answer by Monday. If you're taking the plea, we file the paperwork and move on. If you're going to trial, I need time to build a defense, though I'm telling you right now there isn't much to build with." "What about him?" Whitney's voice was barely above a whisper. "The kid, Jordan Cole, is he going to sue me?" Diane paused at the door. "I'd be shocked if he didn't. And when he does, you're going to lose that case too. So my advice, start liquidating assets. You're going to need the cash." The door closed behind her, and Whitney was alone again in the apartment that suddenly felt too large, too quiet, too full of the life she'd built and lost in the span of a single flight. She walked to the window and looked out over the city, the streets far below teeming with people who had no idea who she was, who would never see the video, who would go about their lives completely untouched by the wreckage of hers. And for the first time since the plane touched down, Whitney allowed herself to cry. 5 days after the investor meeting, Jordan sat in a glass-walled office overlooking the Thames, flanked by Marcus on one side and a team of lawyers on the other. Across the table sat Edmund Cross and 2 of his partners, along with a woman introduced as Fiona Marks, one of the UK's top litigators specializing in discrimination cases. Fiona was in her 50s, with short silver hair and an intensity that filled the room. She'd spent the past hour walking Jordan through the mechanics of the lawsuit, the legal theories they'd pursue, the evidence they'd present. Now she leaned forward, her hands folded on the table. "Here's what you need to understand," she said, her voice crisp and precise. "This case isn't just about winning a judgment against Whitney Harrow. It's about establishing a legal framework that holds individuals accountable for discriminatory behavior in commercial spaces. If we win, it sets a precedent that could be cited in cases across multiple jurisdictions." Jordan frowned. "And if we lose?" "Then Whitney Harrow walks away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist, and the message is that this kind of behavior is tolerable as long as you can afford a good lawyer." "No pressure," Jordan muttered. Fiona's expression softened slightly. I'm not going to lie to you, Jordan. This will be difficult. Harrow's legal team will try to paint you as opportunistic, as someone exploiting a viral moment for financial gain. They'll dig into your background, your company, every decision you've ever made. They'll try to make you the villain. Jordan's jaw tightened. Let them try. That's the spirit, Edmund said from across the table. But you need to be prepared for how ugly this could get. The trial will be public. The media will cover every moment. Your life will be under a microscope. Marcus spoke up. He's already under a microscope. At least this way, he gets to fight back. Fiona nodded. Exactly. And we have one significant advantage, the video. It's clear, it's damning, and it's already in the public consciousness. The court of public opinion has already ruled in your favor. Now we just need to make sure the actual court does the same. Jordan took a slow breath, weighing the decision one final time. He thought about the flight, about Whitney's voice cutting through the cabin, about the water hitting his chest, and the cold certainty that he was about to be dragged off the plane in handcuffs. He thought about every other time he'd been followed in a store, questioned in a lobby, pulled over for driving a car that was too nice for someone who looked like him. And he thought about the thousands of messages he'd received over the past week from people who'd experienced the same thing, who'd been humiliated and dismissed and told they were overreacting, people who were tired of being made invisible. All right, Jordan said quietly. Let's do it. Fiona smiled. Good. We'll file the complaint by the end of the week. Edmund extended his hand across the table. Welcome to the fight, Jordan. This is going to change everything. Jordan shook his hand, hoping Edmund was right. The lawsuit was filed on a Friday afternoon, and by Saturday morning, it was the top story on every major news outlet. The complaint was meticulously detailed, laying out not just the events on the plane, but the broader pattern of discriminatory behavior it represented. It sought compensatory damages, punitive damages, and a public apology. But more than that, it sought acknowledgement, a legal ruling that what Whitney had done was not just rude or inappropriate, but actionable. Jordan woke up in his hotel room to find his phone flooded with notifications. Interview requests from CNN, the BBC, the New York Times, messages of support from civil rights organizations, and inevitably, a torrent of hate mail from people who believed he was playing the victim, weaponizing race, trying to destroy a woman's life over a misunderstanding. He ignored all of it and went for a run along the Thames, his breath fogging in the cold morning air, his mind finally quiet for the first time in days. When he returned to the hotel, Marcus was waiting in the lobby with 2 cups of coffee and a grim expression. We need to talk, Marcus said. They rode the elevator up to Jordan's room in silence. Once inside, Marcus handed him a tablet with a news article pulled up on the screen. The headline read, Whitney Harrow breaks silence, claims she was misunderstood and vilified for expressing concern. Jordan scanned the article, his jaw tightening with every paragraph. Whitney had given an interview to a sympathetic outlet, portraying herself as a concerned passenger who'd been unfairly targeted by a mob mentality. She claimed the video had been edited to make her look worse, that she'd only been trying to ensure the safety of everyone on board, that the real victim was her. She's not even pretending to be sorry, Marcus said. She's doubling down. Jordan set the tablet down, his hand steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Good. Marcus blinked. Good? Yeah. Because now the jury won't have any doubt about what kind of person she is. Jordan pulled out his phone and dialed Fiona's number. She answered on the second ring. I saw the interview, Fiona said before he could speak. Don't worry, it's actually helpful. How? Because she just gave us a preview of her defense strategy, and it's weak. If she goes into court claiming she was misunderstood, we'll bury her under the weight of witness testimony, crew statements, and that video. She's making our job easier. Jordan felt a grim satisfaction settle over him. Then let's make sure we don't waste the opportunity. We won't, Fiona promised. Trust me. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation. Jordan flew back to New York and threw himself into depositions, strategy sessions, and endless meetings with Fiona's legal team. He gave a single interview to a respected journalist who'd covered systemic bias in tech, and used it to frame the lawsuit not as a personal vendetta, but as a necessary step toward accountability. The public response was overwhelming. Crowdfunding campaigns sprang up to support his legal fees, though he didn't need the money. Advocacy groups rallied behind him, and slowly, methodically, the case began to build momentum. Whitney, meanwhile, had taken the plea deal on the criminal charges. She'd been sentenced to 200 hours of community service, 18 months of probation, and mandatory anger management counseling. But the civil case was a different beast entirely, and as the trial date approached, it became clear that this was the fight that would define both of their futures. 3 months after the incident, Jordan stood outside the federal courthouse in Manhattan, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. He wore a dark suit, his expression calm and composed, though his heart hammered in his chest. Fiona stood beside him, addressing the crowd with the confidence of someone who'd won battles like this before. Today, we're here to hold Whitney Harrow accountable, not just for what she did on that plane, but for what her actions represent. Discrimination thrives in silence. It thrives when people look the other way, when consequences are delayed or dismissed. We're here to say that silence ends today. Jordan stepped up to the microphone, his voice clear and steady. I didn't ask to be here. I didn't want my life turned into a headline, but I refuse to let what happened to me be forgotten. This case is about more than one person's prejudice. It's about a system that allows that prejudice to flourish, and I'm going to make sure that system changes. The courthouse doors opened behind him, and Jordan turned, ready to face whatever came next. Inside, Whitney Harrow sat at the defense table, her lawyer whispering urgently in her ear. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of the past 3 months. When Jordan entered the courtroom, her eyes flicked toward him for just a moment before darting away. The trial was about to begin. And one way or another, the world was about to find out what justice really looked like. The judge entered through a door behind the bench, and the entire courtroom rose as one. Judge Margaret Chen was a woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail in a single sweep. She'd spent 23 years on the federal bench and had a reputation for running her courtroom with precision and zero tolerance for theatrics. "Be seated," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly through the space. Jordan lowered himself into the chair beside Fiona, his hands folded carefully on the table in front of him. Across the aisle, Whitney sat rigidly beside her attorney, a man named Lawrence Preston, who looked like he charged by the minute and made sure everyone knew it. Preston was in his 50s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, and wore the kind of calculated confidence that came from winning cases most people thought were unwinnable. Judge Chen adjusted her glasses and looked down at the file before her. We're here today in the matter of Cole versus Harrow. This is a civil action alleging defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and interference with business relations. Counsel, are both parties ready to proceed? Fiona stood smoothly. The plaintiff is ready, Your Honor. Preston rose with equal grace. The defense is ready, Your Honor. Good. Judge Chen's gaze swept across both tables. Before we begin with opening statements, I want to make something very clear. This case has generated significant public attention, and I will not allow this courtroom to become a circus. You will address the facts, you will respect the process, and you will conduct yourselves with professionalism at all times. Is that understood? Yes, Your Honor, both attorneys said in unison. Excellent. Ms. Marks, you may proceed with your opening statement. Fiona stood and moved to the center of the courtroom, her presence commanding without being aggressive. She took a moment to make eye contact with each member of the jury, 12 men and women of varying ages and backgrounds, all of whom had been carefully vetted over the past 2 weeks. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Fiona began, her voice clear and measured. On the night of September 14th, Jordan Cole boarded a flight to London with one purpose, to save his company. He was 19 years old. He'd built a technology platform designed to identify bias in algorithmic systems, and he was flying halfway around the world to pitch investors who held the future of that company in their hands. She paused, letting the image settle. Jordan had earned his seat in first class. He'd paid for it with money from his business account. He'd done everything right. But the moment he sat down, Whitney Harrow decided he didn't belong there. Not because of anything he did, not because of anything he said, but because of how he looked. Fiona turned slightly, gesturing toward Whitney without pointing. Ms. Harrow didn't know Jordan. She'd never spoken to him before that flight. But within minutes of boarding, she began a campaign to have him removed from the cabin. She questioned his ticket. She demanded the flight crew verify his seat assignment. And when none of that worked, she escalated. Fiona's voice took on an edge. She ripped his headphones from his body. She screamed that he had a gun, a false, dangerous accusation that could have gotten him killed. And then, when he still refused to react, she threw water on him, soaking his clothes and damaging his laptop. All of this is captured on video. All of it is corroborated by multiple witnesses. And all of it was motivated by one thing: racial prejudice. She walked slowly back toward the plaintiff's table, her eyes never leaving the jury. This case is about accountability. It's about what happens when someone weaponizes their privilege to harm another person. And it's about sending a message that this behavior has real consequences. We're asking you to hold Whitney Harrow responsible for the damage she caused, not just to Jordan's laptop or his clothes, but to his dignity, his safety, and his ability to conduct his business without fear of being targeted for the color of his skin. Fiona took her seat, and Judge Chen turned to the defense table. Mr. Preston, your opening statement. Preston stood and buttoned his jacket with practiced ease. He moved to the center of the room with the kind of relaxed confidence that suggested he'd done this 1,000 times before. Thank you, Your Honor. He turned to the jury, his expression sympathetic and earnest. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not what the plaintiff would have you believe. This is not a story about racism or discrimination. This is a story about miscommunication, about fear, and about a young man who saw an opportunity to turn an unfortunate incident into a financial windfall. Jordan's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. Preston continued. My client, Whitney Harrow, is not a villain. She's a woman who dedicated her career to building systems that serve millions of people. She's a frequent flyer who has logged hundreds of thousands of miles without a single incident, and on the night of September 14th, she made a mistake. She let her concern for safety override her better judgment, but that mistake does not make her a monster, and it certainly does not entitle Mr. Cole to millions of dollars in damages. He gestured toward Jordan without looking at him directly. Mr. Cole would have you believe that his life was ruined by this incident, but the evidence will show that the opposite is true. In the months since that flight, his company has received millions in venture capital funding. He's been featured in major publications. He's become quite literally a celebrity. And now he's here, asking you to award him damages for a situation that has, by any objective measure, benefited him enormously. Preston's voice softened, taking on a tone of reason. Was my client's behavior perfect that night? No. Did she handle the situation in the best possible way? Absolutely not. But intent matters. And the evidence will show that Whitney Harrow did not act out of malice or prejudice. She acted out of fear, misguided perhaps, but genuine. And that fear does not make her liable for the damages Mr. Cole is seeking. He returned to his seat, and Judge Chen addressed the courtroom. Ms. Marks, call your first witness. Fiona stood. The plaintiff calls Simone Kerr. A door at the side of the courtroom opened, and Simone entered, her posture straight and composed. She'd flown in from her home base in Atlanta specifically for the trial, and she looked every bit the professional she'd been that night on the plane. She took her seat in the witness box and was sworn in. Fiona approached with a warm but professional demeanor. Ms. Kerr, can you tell the jury what you do for a living? I'm a flight attendant with the airline. I've been in that position for 11 years. And were you working on Flight 447 to London on the night of September 14th? I was. I was the lead flight attendant in the first-class cabin. Can you describe for the jury what you observed that night, starting from when passengers began boarding? Simone took a breath, her gaze steady. From the moment Ms. Harrow boarded the aircraft, she seemed fixated on Mr. Cole. She approached me before we even pushed back from the gate and asked me to verify his boarding pass. She said she didn't think he was supposed to be in first class. Did you verify his boarding pass? I did. Mr. Cole's ticket was legitimate. He was assigned a seat 2A, and there was no issue with his reservation. And did you communicate that to Ms. Harrow? I did. I told her that all passengers in the cabin had been verified and that there was no problem. Fiona nodded. How did she respond? She wasn't satisfied. She continued to make comments throughout the boarding process. She told me he was acting suspicious. She suggested he might be hacking into the plane's systems because he was using a laptop. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Chen's gaze sharpened, but she said nothing. "Did Mr. Cole's behavior give you any cause for concern?" Fiona asked. "None whatsoever. He was polite, quiet, and kept to himself. He put on headphones and worked on his computer. That was it." "What happened after the plane began taxiing for takeoff?" Simone's expression darkened. Ms. Harrow unbuckled her seatbelt and approached Mr. Cole's seat. She leaned over him and began accusing him of not belonging there. I intervened and asked her to return to her seat. She refused. The confrontation escalated and she ripped his headphones off. Then she screamed that he had a gun. The courtroom went silent. Every eye was on Simone. "Did Mr. Cole have a gun?" Fiona asked quietly. "No, there was no weapon. Ms. Harrow made that up." "And what happened next?" "She threw a glass of water on him. It soaked his clothes and his belongings. At that point, I activated the emergency protocol and notified the captain. We returned to the gate, and Ms. Harrow was removed from the aircraft by law enforcement." Fiona let the testimony hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "In your 11 years as a flight attendant, have you ever witnessed behavior like this before?" Simone hesitated, then said, "I've seen passengers get upset. I've seen arguments. But I've never seen someone target another passenger the way Ms. Harrow targeted Mr. Cole. It was deliberate, it was relentless, and it was completely unprovoked." "Thank you, Ms. Kerr. No further questions." Preston stood for cross-examination, his expression thoughtful. "Ms. Kerr, you testified that Ms. Harrow expressed concern for safety. Is it fair to say that flight attendants are trained to take safety concerns seriously?" "We are." "And if a passenger expresses fear or discomfort, you're expected to address it, correct?" "Within reason, yes." "So when Mrs. Harrow came to you with concerns about another passenger, you were obligated to at least investigate those concerns, weren't you?" Simone's eyes narrowed slightly. "I investigated by verifying Mr. Cole's ticket and observing his behavior. There was nothing to support her claims." "But you did investigate," Preston pressed, "because even unfounded concerns require a response in the interest of safety." "I responded appropriately, but Ms. Harrow's concerns were not about safety. They were about control." Preston paused, as if considering whether to push further, then nodded. "No further questions." Simone stepped down, and Fiona called her next witness, Captain Miles Carver. Miles entered the courtroom with the same steady presence he brought to the cockpit. He took the stand and was sworn in, his gaze never wavering. Fiona began gently. "Captain Carver, how long have you been flying commercial aircraft?" 26 years. "And in that time, have you ever had to abort a taxi and return to the gate due to a passenger disturbance?" "Twice. Once for a medical emergency, and once on September 14th. "Can you describe for the jury what happened that night?" Miles's voice was measured and clear. "We were preparing for takeoff when I received an emergency call from the lead flight attendant. She reported that a passenger in first class had assaulted another passenger and made a false threat claim. Based on that information, I made the decision to abort the taxi and return to the gate." "What factors went into that decision?" "Safety is always the priority. If there's any indication of a threat, real or perceived, we don't take chances. But in this case, it was also clear from the crew's report that the threat was fabricated. The passenger who made the claim was intoxicated and had been harassing another passenger for the entire boarding process." "Did you speak with Ms. Harrow directly?" "I did. Before the final escalation, I went back to the cabin to address the situation. I asked her to stop engaging with Mr. Cole and to remain in her seat. She agreed at the time, but clearly didn't follow through." "And when you made the decision to remove her from the aircraft, what was your reasoning?" Miles's expression hardened. "She had assaulted a passenger, interfered with the crew's duties, and created a dangerous situation by making a false claim about a weapon. Any one of those actions would have been grounds for removal. All three together?" There was no question. Fiona nodded. "Thank you, Captain. No further questions." Preston approached for cross-examination, his tone respectful. "Captain Carver, you mentioned that safety is always the priority. Is it fair to say that in situations involving potential threats, you err on the side of caution?" "Always." "So if a passenger reports feeling unsafe, you take that seriously, even if the threat turns out to be unfounded?" We take all concerns seriously, but we also assess the credibility of those concerns. In this case, the crew's assessment was that Ms. Harrow's claims were not credible. Preston tilted his head. But you weren't in the cabin during the initial interactions, were you? No, I was in the cockpit, but I trust my crew's judgment. They're trained professionals, and they were in a position to observe the situation firsthand. Thank you, Captain. No further questions. The trial continued through the afternoon, witness after witness building a portrait of that night on the plane. A passenger from row 4 testified that Whitney had been visibly agitated from the moment Jordan sat down. Another passenger described the moment she screamed about a gun and the panic that rippled through the cabin. Ethan Raines, the man who'd recorded the video, took the stand and explained why he'd felt compelled to document what he was seeing. I've spent my career working in tech, Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. I've seen bias play out in hiring, in funding, in every corner of the industry. And what I saw on that plane was the same thing in a different context. Someone with power trying to erase someone without it. I recorded it because I knew that without evidence, no one would believe it happened. By the time the court adjourned for the day, the narrative was clear. Whitney Harrow had targeted Jordan Cole without provocation, escalated the situation despite multiple interventions, and caused tangible harm through her actions. But the defense hadn't presented its case yet, and everyone in that courtroom knew that Preston was saving his ammunition for when it mattered most. The next morning, Preston called Whitney to the stand. She walked to the witness box with her head held high, though her hands trembled slightly as she placed one on the Bible and raised the other to be sworn in. She wore a navy suit and minimal jewelry, the image of a professional woman who'd been wronged by circumstance. Preston began with softballs, establishing her career, her credentials, her years of loyal service to Sentinel Analytics. Then he moved to the night of the flight. Ms. Harrow, can you describe what was going through your mind when you first saw Mr. Cole board the aircraft? Whitney's voice was soft, almost fragile. I didn't think anything at first, but then I noticed he was sitting in first class, and he seemed out of place. Out of place how? He was wearing a hoodie. He had a backpack. He looked young. I thought maybe there had been a mistake. Maybe he'd been seated in the wrong section. Did you approach him directly about this? No, I spoke to the flight attendant first. I didn't want to embarrass him if there had been an error. Preston nodded sympathetically. And when the flight attendant told you his ticket was valid, did you accept that? Whitney hesitated. I tried to, but as the flight went on, I started to feel uneasy. He was typing constantly on his computer, pages and pages of code. I thought maybe he was trying to access the plane's systems. Fiona's pen scratched furiously across her legal pad, but she said nothing. Preston continued. Did you intend to harm Mr. Cole when you approached him later? No. Whitney's voice cracked. I was scared. I thought I was protecting people. I know now that I was wrong, but in that moment, I genuinely believed there was a threat. And when you said he had a gun, were you lying? No, I thought I saw something in his bag. I was panicking. I made a mistake. Preston let the words settle before continuing. Ms. Harrow, do you consider yourself a racist? Whitney's eyes filled with tears. Absolutely not. I've worked with people from all backgrounds my entire career. I've mentored young professionals of all races. I made a terrible mistake that night, but it wasn't because of prejudice. It was because of fear. Preston returned to his seat. No further questions. Judge Chen looked to Fiona. Cross-examination? Fiona stood slowly, her expression unreadable. She approached the witness stand and stood directly in front of Whitney, her gaze unwavering. Ms. Harrow, you testified that you thought Mr. Cole was out of place because he was wearing a hoodie and carrying a backpack. Is that correct? Yes. Are hoodies prohibited in first class? Whitney blinked. Well, no, but are backpacks prohibited in first class? No. So the only thing that made Mr. Cole seem out of place to you was his appearance? I suppose so. Fiona's voice sharpened. You testified that you've mentored young professionals of all races. Can you name a single black professional you've mentored in the past 5 years? Whitney's mouth opened, then closed. I don't remember specific names. You don't remember a single name. It's been a long career. There have been many people. Fiona pulled a document from her folder. This is a list of every mentee listed on your professional profile. 23 names. Not one of them is black. Does that refresh your memory? Whitney's face flushed. I didn't choose mentees based on race. Clearly, Fiona set the document aside. You also testified that you thought you saw something in Mr. Cole's bag that made you believe he had a gun. What did you see? I thought I saw the shape of something. The shape of something. Can you be more specific? It was dark. The cabin lights were dim. I couldn't see clearly. So you screamed that a 19-year-old had a gun based on a shape you couldn't see clearly in dim lighting. I was scared. Were you scared when you ripped his headphones off? Whitney faltered. I wanted him to listen to me. Were you scared when you threw water on him? I was angry. Angry at what, Ms. Harrow? Angry that he wouldn't leave? Angry that the crew wouldn't remove him? Angry that a young black man had the audacity to sit in first class and ignore you? Preston shot to his feet. Objection. Argumentative. Judge Chen's expression was stern. Sustained. Ms. Marks, rephrase. Fiona took a step back, her tone cooling. Ms. Harrow, do you believe your actions that night were motivated by racial bias? No. Do you believe that unconscious bias might have played a role? Whitney's hands clenched in her lap. I don't know, maybe, but I didn't intend to hurt anyone. Fiona's voice was quiet but devastating. Intent doesn't erase harm, Ms. Harrow, and the harm you caused was very real. She returned to her seat. No further questions. The courtroom was silent as Whitney stepped down. Her composure shattered. Her tears no longer an asset, but a testament to the weight of her own actions. The trial lasted 3 more days, with expert witnesses on both sides dissecting the psychological impact of the incident, the economic damages to Jordan's business, and the broader implications of holding individuals accountable for discriminatory behavior in commercial spaces. But the turning point had already come. The jury had seen Whitney crumble under cross-examination. They'd watched Jordan sit calmly through every moment of testimony, his dignity intact even as his ordeal was replayed in excruciating detail. When both sides rested and closing arguments concluded, Judge Chen sent the jury to deliberate. Jordan sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, his back against the cold wall, his eyes closed. Marcus sat beside him, scrolling through his phone in silence. Fiona had gone to make calls, confident but unwilling to make predictions. However this goes, Marcus said quietly, you did something important here. Jordan opened his eyes. We haven't won yet. Doesn't matter. You stood up. You made her answer for what she did. That's worth something. Jordan wanted to believe that, but he wouldn't feel it, not really, until the verdict came in. 2 hours later, the jury returned. Judge Chen took her seat, and the courtroom fell silent. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson, a middle-aged woman in a gray sweater, stood. We have, Your Honor. Please read the verdict. The foreperson unfolded a piece of paper, her hand steady. In the matter of Cole versus Harrow, on the count of defamation, we find in favor of the plaintiff. On the count of intentional infliction of emotional distress, we find in favor of the plaintiff. On the count of interference with business relations, we find in favor of the plaintiff. Jordan's breath caught. We award compensatory damages in the amount of $200,000, and we award punitive damages in the amount of $3 million. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for the doors. Whitney buried her face in her hands. Jordan sat perfectly still, the words washing over him like a wave he couldn't quite process. $3 million. Not because he needed the money, but because the jury had looked at the evidence and decided that what Whitney had done demanded a price that couldn't be ignored. Judge Chen banged her gavel. Order. Order in the court. Fiona leaned over and squeezed Jordan's shoulder. You did it. Jordan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. And across the aisle, Whitney Harrow sat in ruins, finally understanding that consequences were real. The courthouse steps were a madhouse. Cameras flashed in rapid succession, microphones thrust forward like weapons, reporters shouting questions that blended into an incomprehensible roar. Jordan stood at the center of it all, Fiona at his side, Marcus just behind his left shoulder, and he felt strangely calm. The verdict was still settling into his bones, the weight of it both lighter and heavier than he'd expected. Fiona raised a hand, and the crowd quieted just enough for her voice to carry. Today, a jury affirmed what we've known from the beginning, that Whitney Harrow's actions on that flight were not a misunderstanding. They were not a mistake born of reasonable concern. They were deliberate, discriminatory, and caused real harm to my client. This verdict sends a clear message. Bias has consequences, and those consequences will be enforced. A reporter from the front row called out, "Mr. Cole, what do you plan to do with the $3 million in punitive damages?" Jordan stepped forward, and the cameras swiveled toward him. He'd thought about this moment for weeks, rehearsed different versions of what he might say, but now that he was standing here, only one answer felt right. "I'm donating it," he said simply. The crowd erupted again, questions flying fast and overlapping. Jordan held up a hand and waited for silence. "Every dollar of the punitive damages will go toward creating a scholarship fund for Black students pursuing careers in aviation. Pilots, engineers, air traffic controllers, whatever path they choose. The fund will be named the Whitney Harrow Aviation Scholarship." The reporters went silent for a beat, processing the implications. Jordan continued, his voice steady. "She tried to make me feel like I didn't belong in first class. So I'm going to make sure an entire generation gets to sit in the cockpit. And every time someone receives that scholarship, every time they see her name attached to it, they'll know exactly why it exists." A journalist near the back shouted, "That's incredibly generous, but also, some might say, incredibly harsh. Do you think Ms. Harrow deserves that?" Jordan's expression didn't change. "I think she deserves to be reminded every single day that her actions have consequences. And I think the young people who benefit from this fund deserve to know that even when someone tries to tear you down, you can turn that pain into something that lifts other people up. So yes, she deserves exactly this." He turned and walked down the steps, Marcus and Fiona flanking him, the crowd parting reluctantly as they made their way to the waiting car. Behind them, through the glass doors of the courthouse, Whitney emerged with her lawyer, her face ashen, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She glanced toward the mass of reporters, seemed to consider saying something, then turned and disappeared back inside. The car pulled away from the curb, and Jordan finally allowed himself to exhale. "That was a hell of a move," Marcus said from the front seat. "The scholarship, you didn't tell me you were planning that." "I wasn't sure I would until I said it," Jordan admitted. "But it felt right." Fiona, seated beside him, gave him an appraising look. "You just made her name synonymous with the exact thing she tried to deny. It's brilliant and brutal." Jordan stared out the window at the city rolling past, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the streets. "She wanted me erased. I'm making sure she's remembered. Seems fair." The next several weeks unfolded in a blur of activity. Ethos AI's profile skyrocketed in the wake of the trial. The company that had been a promising startup with a handful of beta clients suddenly found itself fielding inquiries from Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and educational institutions. Jordan hired a team of engineers, brought on a chief operating officer to handle the business side, and watched his vision expand beyond anything he'd imagined 6 months ago. But the scholarship fund was what consumed his nights. He worked with lawyers to establish the legal framework, partnered with aviation organizations to identify deserving candidates, and personally reviewed the first round of applications that came flooding in. There were hundreds, young people from every corner of the country, each with their own story of dreaming about the sky and being told they didn't belong there. One application came from a 17-year-old girl in Atlanta named Kira Matthews. Her essay was 3 pages long and talked about watching planes take off from Hartsfield-Jackson as a child, dreaming of being the one in the captain's seat, only to be told by a high school guidance counselor that people like her didn't become pilots. She'd applied to aviation programs anyway, working 2 jobs to save for flight school, and now she was asking for help to make the dream real. Jordan read her essay twice, then called Marcus into his office. "This one," he said, sliding the application across the desk. "She's our first recipient." Marcus scanned the essay, his expression softening. "She reminds me of you." "That's the point." Jordan personally called Kira to tell her she'd been selected. The sound of her voice breaking with disbelief and gratitude stayed with him for days. The scholarship was announced in a press conference 3 months after the trial. Jordan stood at a podium in a community center in Harlem, Kira beside him, and explained what the fund would do and why it mattered. The room was packed with journalists, community leaders, and young people who saw themselves in Kira's story. "This scholarship exists because someone tried to make me feel like I didn't belong," Jordan said, his voice carrying through the room. "But it also exists because I refuse to let that moment define me. I'm not going to spend my life angry. I'm going to spend it making sure the next generation has doors open that were closed for too long." Kira stepped up to the microphone, her hands shaking but her voice clear. "I never thought I'd be able to afford flight school. I thought my dream was just that, a dream. But Mr. Cole and this scholarship are giving me a chance, and I'm not going to waste it. I'm going to earn my wings, and then I'm going to help other people earn theirs." The applause was deafening. Across the city, in a small rent-controlled apartment in Queens that was a far cry from her former Upper East Side penthouse, Whitney Harrow sat on a threadbare couch and watched the press conference on her laptop. Her hands trembled as she listened to Jordan speak, as she heard her own name attached to a scholarship designed to undo the very thing she'd tried to enforce. The past 6 months had stripped her of everything: her job, her reputation, her savings, most of which had been liquidated to pay legal fees and the compensatory damages from the lawsuit. The punitive damages had been covered by selling her apartment, her car, and nearly every asset she owned. She'd moved into this small studio 2 weeks ago, her entire life reduced to a few boxes and the crushing weight of her own mistakes. She'd tried to rebuild. She'd applied for positions at smaller firms, reached out to old colleagues, even considered starting her own consulting business. But her name was poisoned now. Every Google search led back to the video, the trial, the verdict. No one would hire her. No one would work with her. She was radioactive. Her court-ordered community service had been assigned by a judge who clearly relished the irony: 200 hours at a youth coding program in the Bronx, teaching kids from underserved communities the basics of computer science. The same kids she'd spent her career overlooking, dismissed as lacking potential or pedigree. She'd started the previous week, walking into a cramped classroom filled with teenagers who looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The program director, a no-nonsense woman named Clara Rodriguez, had made it clear that Whitney was there to work, not to be coddled. "These kids don't need your pity," Clara had said bluntly. "They need someone who's going to show up, put in the effort, and treat them like they matter. Can you do that?" Whitney had nodded, too exhausted to argue. The first session had been brutal. She'd tried to explain basic algorithms to a room full of kids who had no reason to trust her, and the skepticism had been palpable. One boy, maybe 14, had raised his hand and asked, "Aren't you that lady from the plane? The racist one?" The room had gone silent. Whitney had felt every eye on her, waiting to see how she'd respond. "Yes," she'd said quietly. "That's me. So why should we listen to you?" It was a fair question. Whitney had looked at the boy, really looked at him, and seen the same wariness she'd directed at Jordan that night on the plane. The same assumption that someone didn't belong based on nothing but appearance. "Because I made a terrible mistake," she'd said finally, "and I'm trying to figure out how to be better. I don't know if I can, but I'm here, and I'm going to try." The boy had stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, let's see." Now, watching Jordan and Kira on the screen, Whitney felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months. Shame that went deeper than embarrassment, deeper than regret. It was the kind of shame that forced her to confront not just what she'd done, but who she'd been. The assumptions she'd carried, the biases she'd refused to examine, the ease with which she'd wielded her privilege as a weapon. She closed the laptop and sat in the silence of her apartment, the walls pressing in around her. The program at the Bronx Community Center became the only structure in Whitney's life. She showed up every Tuesday and Thursday evening, taught the lessons Clara assigned, and slowly, painfully slowly, began to see the kids as individuals rather than abstractions. There was Miguel, who had a gift for debugging code that rivaled engineers twice his age. There was Ayana, who wanted to build apps that helped people in her neighborhood access resources. There was David, the boy who'd called her out that first day, who turned out to have a wicked sense of humor and a mind that could solve problems 3 steps ahead of where Whitney was teaching. Clara observed from the back of the room during the sessions, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. After the 4th week, she pulled Whitney aside. "You're doing better," Clara said. "The kids are starting to trust you." Whitney looked down at her hands. "I don't deserve their trust." "Maybe not, but you're earning it anyway. That's what matters." "Is it enough?" Whitney's voice was barely above a whisper. "To just show up and try? After everything I did?" Claire's expression softened, but only slightly. "I don't know. That's not for me to decide. But I'll tell you this. Redemption isn't a destination. It's a process. And the only way through it is to keep showing up even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Whitney nodded. Blinking back tears she refused to let fall in front of Clara. 6 months after the trial, Jordan received an unexpected email. It was from Clara Rodriguez, and the subject line read, "Thought you should know." He opened it and found a short message. "One of my students told me he wants to build bias detection software like yours. When I asked why, he said it was because Ms. Harrow showed him that even people who do bad things can try to do better. I thought you'd want to know she's actually putting in the work here. Doesn't erase what she did. But it's something." Attached was a photo of Whitney standing in front of a whiteboard covered in code, surrounded by a group of teenagers who were actually smiling. Jordan stared at the photo for a long time. He thought about forwarding it to Marcus or to Fiona, or posting it online with some commentary about the complexity of accountability. But in the end, he simply saved it to a folder on his desktop and closed the email. She was trying. That was more than he'd expected. But it didn't change the past. And it didn't erase the harm. It was just a data point, one small piece of a much larger story. Ethos AI's growth continued to accelerate. By the end of the year, the company had secured contracts with 3 major tech firms, 2 federal agencies, and a coalition of universities looking to audit their admissions algorithms. Jordan hired his 50th employee in December, moved the company into a sleek office space in Manhattan, and found himself fielding calls from venture capital firms offering valuations that would have seemed impossible a year ago. But the work that mattered most to him was still the scholarship fund. The first cohort of recipients, 15 students, including Kira, had begun their training programs. Jordan made it a point to meet each of them, to hear their stories, to remind them that they weren't just receiving financial support, but joining a community that believed in their potential. Kira sent him updates every few weeks, photos from her first solo flight, videos of her practicing emergency procedures, a selfie in front of a Cessna 102 with the caption, "One step closer to the big jets." Jordan pinned the photo to the wall in his office, right next to the legal pad he'd used to diagram Ethos AI's architecture in that investor meeting, reminders of where he'd started and where he was going. 1 year after the trial, Jordan was invited to speak at a conference on algorithmic accountability in San Francisco. The audience was packed with engineers, executives, policymakers, and academics, people who had the power to implement the kind of systems Ethos AI was building. He took the stage to thunderous applause, the kind of reception that still felt surreal. He talked about the technology, about the importance of embedding fairness into the systems that shaped people's lives. But he also talked about the flight, about Whitney, about the moment that had changed everything. "I didn't ask to become a symbol," he said, his voice steady. "I didn't want my worst day to become a public spectacle. But it happened, and I had a choice. I could let that moment define me as a victim, or I could use it as fuel to build something that mattered. I chose the latter. And I'd make the same choice again." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. But here's the thing. Accountability isn't just about punishing people who do harm. It's about creating systems that make harm harder to inflict in the first place. Whitney Harrow targeted me because the system allowed her to, because there were no checks, no consequences, no mechanism to stop her until it was too late. That's what we're trying to fix. Not just for me, for everyone who comes after. The applause was deafening. After the conference, Jordan flew back to New York and went directly to the Bronx Community Center. He hadn't told Clara he was coming, but he wanted to see the program for himself, to understand what Whitney was actually doing there. He arrived during an evening session and stood in the back of the room, unnoticed. Whitney was at the front, walking a group of students through a debugging exercise. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her clothes understated, her demeanor stripped of the entitlement that had defined her on the plane. She was patient with the students, answering questions without condescension, praising their progress without patronizing them. One of the students, a girl who couldn't have been more than 13, raised her hand. "Ms. Harrow, why do you keep coming here? You finished your community service hours 2 months ago." Whitney hesitated, then set down her marker. "Because I owe a debt I can't repay. And because you all deserve someone who shows up. So I'm going to keep showing up for as long as you'll let me." Jordan felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness. He wasn't ready for that, might never be ready for that. But recognition. Whitney was doing the work. Not for redemption, maybe, but because it was the only path forward she had left. He slipped out of the room before anyone noticed him and called Clara from the parking lot. "I saw her," he said when she picked up. And I don't know what to do with it." Clara's voice was gentle. "You don't have to do anything with it, Jordan. She's not your responsibility. You already did what you needed to do." "Then why does it feel unfinished?" "Because healing isn't linear, and neither is accountability. You're allowed to feel complicated about this." Jordan leaned against his car, the cold night air biting at his skin. "She's trying, though. That counts for something." "It does. But it doesn't erase what she did. Both things can be true." "Yeah," Jordan said quietly. "Both things can be true." 2 years after the trial, Kira Matthews earned her commercial pilot's license. Jordan flew to Atlanta for the ceremony, watching from the crowd as she walked across the stage, her uniform crisp, her smile radiant. She found him afterward and pulled him into a hug that nearly knocked him off balance. "I did it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I actually did it." "You did," Jordan said. "And this is just the beginning." Kira pulled back, her eyes shining. "I got an offer from a regional carrier. I start training next month. First Officer Matthews has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Jordan grinned. "It really does." Later that night, Kira posted a photo on social media, her standing in front of a plane, her pilot's license held up to the camera. The caption read, "They told me I didn't belong in the sky. The Whitney Harrow Aviation Scholarship told me otherwise. To everyone who dreams of flying, your wings are waiting. Go get them." The post went viral within hours, shared by pilots, aviation enthusiasts, and people who'd followed Jordan's story from the beginning. It was picked up by news outlets, featured in think pieces about the power of turning pain into purpose. And in her small apartment in Queens, Whitney saw it and wept. 3 years after the trial, Jordan stood in the lobby of Ethos AI's headquarters, watching as his team prepared for the company's largest product launch to date. The bias detection system was being integrated into hiring platforms used by over 200 companies, with contracts pending for another 100. The technology he'd built in a cramped apartment while working 2 jobs had become an industry standard. Marcus walked up beside him, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He passed one to Jordan and clinked their cups together. "To dreams that refuse to die." Jordan smiled. "To dreams that refuse to die." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the organized chaos unfold around them. "You ever think about that night on the plane?" Marcus asked. "Every day," Jordan admitted. "But not the way I used to. It doesn't own me anymore. It's just part of the story." "A hell of a story." "Yeah, but it's not over yet." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Jordan pulled out his phone and showed Marcus an email. It was from a major airline proposing a partnership to integrate Ethos AI's technology into their hiring and customer service training programs. The goal? To identify and address bias before it ever reached the cabin. "They want us to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else," Jordan said. "I told them yes." Marcus's grin was infectious. "Of course you did." In the Bronx, Whitney finished her final session at the community center. The students had thrown her a small goodbye party. Homemade cupcakes, a card signed by everyone in the program, and a gift that made her throat tighten when she unwrapped it. A framed photo of the entire group with a handwritten note that read, "Thank you for showing us that people can change." Clara walked her to the door. her expression as stern as ever, but her eyes warm. "You did good work here, Whitney. The kids are going to miss you." Whitney looked back at the classroom, at the faces that had become familiar over the past 2 years. "I'm going to miss them too. So don't disappear. You're welcome back any time. Not as community service, just as someone who gives a damn." Whitney nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She walked out into the cool evening air and stood on the sidewalk, watching the city move around her. She'd lost everything: her career, her wealth, her reputation. But somewhere in the wreckage, she'd found something she hadn't known she was missing. A sense of purpose that didn't come from a title or a paycheck, but from showing up for people who had every reason not to trust her. It wasn't redemption. She wasn't sure she deserved that. But it was a start. 5 years after the trial, Jordan stood on a stage at the National Aviation Museum, addressing a room full of scholarship recipients, their families, and supporters. The Whitney Harrow Aviation Scholarship had grown beyond anything he'd imagined. Over 300 students funded, 57 who'd already earned their wings, 12 who were now flying for major carriers. Kira was in the front row, now a captain at a major airline, her uniform decorated with the stripes she'd worked so hard to earn. Beside her sat 3 of her mentees, young people she was guiding through the same path she'd walked. Jordan looked out at the crowd and felt the weight of what they'd built together. 5 years ago, I sat on a plane and experienced something that no one should have to experience. I was judged, humiliated, and targeted for no reason other than the color of my skin. But I made a choice that night, and every night since, to turn that pain into power. To build something that would outlast the moment. To make sure that the next generation wouldn't just survive in spaces they were told they didn't belong. They'd thrive. He paused, his voice softening. "This scholarship bears the name of the woman who tried to erase me. And I know some people think that's cruel, but I think it's honest. Because every time someone receives this scholarship, they're reminded that even the worst moments can become fuel for the best outcomes. That you can take someone's attempt to diminish you and turn it into a legacy that lifts thousands." The room erupted in applause, and Jordan stepped back from the podium, his heart full in a way he hadn't thought possible 5 years ago. After the event, a young man approached him, barely 17, with nervous eyes and a folder clutched in his hands. "Mr. Cole? I just got accepted into flight school because of your scholarship. I wanted to say thank you." Jordan shook his hand. "What's your name?" "Isaiah. Isaiah Grant." "Isaiah, you earned this. Don't ever forget that. The scholarship opened a door, but you're the one who's going to walk through it." Isaiah nodded, his eyes bright. "I won't let you down." "You won't," Jordan said. "I already know that." As Isaiah walked away, Marcus appeared at Jordan's side. "You know what the best part of all this is?" "What's that?" "She thought she could destroy you. Instead, she made you unstoppable." Jordan looked out at the crowd, at the faces of young people who'd been told they didn't belong and were proving the world wrong, one flight at a time. "Yeah, I guess she did." Somewhere across the city, Whitney Harrow sat in a coffee shop, her laptop open to an article about the scholarship event. She read Jordan's words, looked at the photos of the students, and felt the familiar ache of regret mixed with something new. A quiet, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, her name could become associated with something other than her worst moment. She closed the laptop and stared out the window at the planes tracing lines across the sky, metal birds carrying people to places they'd once only dreamed of reaching. She would never undo what she'd done. The harm was permanent, etched into the record of both their lives. But Jordan had taken that harm and transformed it into something that would outlive them both. And in the end, that was the only justice that mattered. The sky belonged to everyone now, and no one could take that away. And